My name is Lauren. I am 32 years old, and I spent weeks searching for the perfect dress for my younger sister Madison's upcoming wedding. When I called my Aunt Diane to double check the color scheme so I would not clash with the bridal party, she went completely dead silent on the line. Lauren, she whispered, her voice trembling. The wedding already happened last Saturday. The betrayal cut me to the bone. But what happened a few weeks later, when my sister demanded the keys to my luxury lake house, was the real shock. I said no. What she did not know was that I had already uncovered the federal crimes funding their entire fake life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever been excluded by the people who share your blood. As a forensic accountant working in downtown Chicago, my entire career is built on uncovering the truth. I spend my days tracking hidden assets, exposing corporate fraud, and following money trails that people desperately want to keep buried. I am trained to spot lies on a balance sheet, but I completely miss the massive deception happening within my own family. It was a Tuesday afternoon. I was sitting in my office overlooking the Chicago River, taking a quick break from a grueling audit. I picked up my phone and dialed my Aunt Diane. The wedding was supposed to be in 3 weeks or so, I had been told. I wanted to make sure my navy blue dress would not clash with the groomsmen. Aunt Diane answered the phone with her usual cheerful greeting, but the moment I mentioned the wedding, the line went deathly quiet. I asked if the connection was bad. Then came the words that shattered my reality. She told me the wedding had already taken place at a luxury estate in the Hamptons. I sat frozen in my ergonomic office chair. My brain, usually so adept at processing complex financial data, completely short-circuited. How could my own sister get married without me? How could my parents, who I spoke to just last week, hide an entire destination wedding? I thanked. Aunt Diane hung up the phone and immediately grabbed my car keys. I did not cry. I did not scream. My professional instincts kicked in, replacing my grief with a cold, calculated need for answers. I drove straight to my parents' house in Winnetka, an affluent suburb north of the city. The drive took 45 minutes, giving me plenty of time to process the sheer magnitude of their deception. My parents, Richard and Patricia, cared about appearances more than anything else in the world. They lived in a sprawling 5-bedroom house with a perfectly manicured lawn, always eager to project an image of extreme wealth and high society status. I marched up their stone walkway and unlocked the front door with my spare key. I found them in the sunroom, casually sipping expensive red wine and reviewing what looked like catering invoices. They both jumped when I walked in. My mother immediately reached over and flipped the invoices face down on the glass table. "Why did Aunt Diane just tell me that Madison got married last Saturday?" I asked, keeping my voice dangerously level. My father cleared his throat, adjusting his posture to adopt his usual authoritative stance. He told me to sit down, but I refused to move. My mother let out a long, theatrical sigh, swirling the wine in her glass. She looked at me not with guilt, but with profound annoyance. "We were going to tell you eventually, Lauren," my mother said. "But you have to understand the situation. Madison married Terrence. He is a highly successful African-American investment fund manager who moves in extremely elite circles. His family is highly respected, and his investors are billionaires. We needed this wedding to project a very specific, flawless image." I stared at her, struggling to comprehend the sheer vanity of her words. I asked her what my presence had to do with their flawless image. My father stepped in, his tone dripping with condescension. "You live a very pragmatic lifestyle, Lauren. You interrogate people for a living. You wear sensible suits, you drive a standard sedan, and you do not care about high fashion or luxury networking. Terrence is managing a highly exclusive image for his fund. We could not risk you showing up and asking your usual probing questions or embarrassing Madison in front of his high society guests. You just do not fit into that world." The sheer audacity of his explanation hit me like a physical blow. They had banned me from my only sister's wedding because I was not flashy enough for her new husband's elite network. They erased me from family photos to protect a fraudulent image of wealth. But the hypocrisy went much deeper than just appearances. A wave of absolute fury washed over me as a specific memory from exactly 12 months ago rushed to the forefront of my mind. Last year, I had a sudden medical emergency that required an unexpected surgery. Due to an insurance dispute, I was hit with a massive medical bill right as I was putting a down payment on my lake house. I had swallowed my pride and begged my parents for a small short-term loan just to cover the surgical costs. They sat in this exact same sunroom and looked me in the eye, claiming they were entirely broke. They said they had zero liquid assets and told me I needed to be more financially responsible. I had to drain my emergency retirement fund to pay for my hospital stay. Yet here they were sitting amidst the financial wreckage of a luxury Hamptons wedding. I looked down at the invoices my mother had tried to hide. I could see the logo of a premier New York catering company. "You told me you were broke when I was lying in a hospital bed," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "You refused to help your own daughter pay for surgery, but you secretly funded a massive destination wedding for Madison, just to impress a flashy investment manager." My mother rolled her eyes, completely dismissing my pain. "That was different, Lauren. This wedding was an investment in Madison's future. Terrence is going to make this family incredibly wealthy. You are an independent woman who can take care of herself. You should be happy for your sister instead of making this all about your past grievances." I looked at the two people who raised me and realized I felt absolutely nothing for them anymore. They had weighed my value against a superficial social climbing opportunity and decided I was entirely disposable. I turned around and walked out the front door without saying another word. I did not know it yet, but my exclusion from that wedding was the greatest gift they could have ever given me. I was about to discover that the glamorous investment fund manager my parents worshipped was actually a ticking time bomb. I sat in the driver's seat of my sensible sedan, the exact car my father had just mocked, gripping the steering wheel until my knuckles turned stark white. The engine was off. The quiet tree-lined streets of the affluent Winnetka suburb pressed in on me, but my mind was roaring. I pulled my phone from my purse with trembling fingers. If my family had successfully hidden an entire destination wedding from me, there had to be a massive digital footprint. People who are obsessed with high society status and projecting wealth simply cannot resist showing off on the internet. They just made absolutely sure to block me from seeing any of it. I opened the Instagram app. I navigated straight to my sister Madison's profile. It showed as completely unavailable, blocked. I checked my mother's profile next, also blocked. The level of cold, calculated premeditation was staggering. They had actively restricted my accounts weeks ago, and I had been too busy working exhausting 50-hour weeks at my downtown forensic accounting firm to even notice the digital silence. But I investigate complex financial crimes for a living. Hiding digital assets from me is a profound mistake. I logged out of my personal account and quickly opened a blank, untraceable burner profile I use strictly for investigating corporate fraudsters. I typed Madison's handle into the search bar. The profile loaded immediately, completely public for the world to admire. There it was. The very first post on her grid was a meticulously edited video montage set to sweeping classical music titled "The Perfect Day." I tapped the screen and watched my family's betrayal unfold in high definition. The footage opened on a sprawling, breathtaking luxury estate in the Hamptons. Aerial drone shots captured immaculate manicured gardens leading down to a pristine private beach. Hundreds of guests mingled on the lawn, draped in bespoke designer gowns and tailored tuxedos. Right in the center of the spectacle stood Madison and Terrence. Terrence looked exactly like the flashy, untouchable investment fund manager my parents idolized. He wore a custom-tailored velvet tuxedo and a massive diamond-encrusted watch, caught the harsh sunlight as he kissed my sister. Madison was draped in a heavily beaded couture bridal gown that I immediately recognized from a high-end Parisian designer. That dress alone cost more than my annual rent. The camera panned over cascading floral arrangements made of thousands of rare white orchids clearly imported from overseas. There was a towering 10-tier wedding cake adorned with edible gold leaf. A private orchestra played in the background while waitstaff in crisp white uniforms served champagne that easily cost hundreds of dollars a bottle. My forensic accounting brain automatically began running the numbers, tallying the extravagant expenses flashing across my screen. The venue rental in the Hamptons during peak wedding season was easily $50,000. The catering for at least 200 guests, based on the plated lobster and shaved truffles I saw in the background of the reception shots, was another $60,000 minimum. The custom floral designs, the imported designer wardrobe, the live private orchestra, the professional drone videography team, and the premium open bar. I was looking at a minimum baseline of $200,000. It was likely much more. This staggering display of wealth made my stomach violently turn. It was not jealousy clouding my vision. It was the sickening, gut-wrenching realization of the absolute lie I had been fed exactly 12 months prior. The memory crashed into me with the destructive force of a freight train. Last autumn, I collapsed in my office from a suddenly ruptured appendix. The emergency surgery saved my life, but the resulting severe complications kept me trapped in a hospital bed for 2 agonizing weeks. My health insurance company ruthlessly denied a massive portion of the claim due to a technicality regarding out-of-network surgical providers. I was suddenly staring at a crippling medical debt, right as the final closing costs on my Lake Geneva property were due. I had never asked my parents for a single dime since the day I turned 18. I paid my own way through state college. I funded my own rigorous accounting certifications. But standing on the precipice of losing the lake house, I had worked years to afford, and drowning in unexpected medical debt. I swallowed my pride. I drove to their house, sat in that exact same sunroom, and laid out my financial spreadsheets. I begged them for a short-term interest-bearing loan. I promised in writing to pay them back within 8 months. My father had looked at my hospital bills, sighed heavily, and told me their assets were entirely illiquid. My mother had patted my hand, claiming the economy was rough, and their investment portfolios were locked up. They swore to me they had absolutely no cash to spare. They watched me drain my hard-earned retirement savings just to survive. Now staring at the glowing screen, watching my mother wearing a custom silk gown and toasting with vintage champagne, the timeline aligned perfectly. While I was recovering from traumatic abdominal surgery and eating cheap canned soup to rebuild my decimated savings, they were secretly wiring massive six-figure deposits to Hampton's wedding planners. They did not just lie about being broke. They actively chose to watch their oldest daughter suffer so they could finance a superficial, glittering spectacle to impress a man they barely knew. The grief evaporated completely from my chest. It was instantly replaced by a razor-sharp, icy clarity. I stopped looking at the video as a betrayed, heartbroken sister and started looking at it as a lead financial investigator. I began taking screenshots. I screenshotted the venue location tags. I captured the names of the catering companies, the elite florists, and the luxury car rental services tagged in the posts. I expanded the comments section and screenshotted the wealthy investors Terrence had invited, the powerful men my parents were so desperate to impress. I then tapped on Terrence's profile. His feed was a masterclass in aggressive, insecure wealth projection. Photos of him standing confidently in front of leased private jets. Videos of him popping incredibly expensive bottles at exclusive VIP clubs in Manhattan. Captions constantly boasting about guaranteed double-digit returns for his elite investment fund. Every single post was meticulously designed to scream unparalleled success. But my professional instincts were screaming something else entirely. Genuine wealth whispers, but fake wealth screams. Terrence was trying way too hard to look rich. The massive watch, the rented jets, the desperate need to surround himself with billionaires at a wedding funded by his middle-class in-laws. The math was completely wrong. If Terrence was as wildly successful as my parents claimed, why did they need to pay for this extravagant Hamptons event? Why were my parents, who were financially comfortable but certainly not ultra-rich, footing a $200,000 bill for a millionaire fund manager? I saved every single image to an encrypted cloud folder. I documented the precise timestamps, the geographic locations, and the tagged business associates. My family thought they had successfully excluded me and protected their flawless image. They had no idea, they just handed a highly trained financial investigator the exact roadmap needed to dismantle their entire lives. I locked my phone, put my sensible sedan in drive, and headed back to my office. The personal heartbreak was over. The financial autopsy was just beginning. For exactly 21 days, following my discovery of the hidden wedding album, my phone remained completely silent. Not a single text message, not one missed call, and absolutely no apologies from anyone sharing my DNA. My parents, Richard and Patricia, were likely still nursing hangovers from their opulent Hamptons weekend, or perhaps busy calculating how to hide the massive financial crater they had just blown in their own retirement accounts. Madison and Terrence were presumably on a lavish honeymoon, posting meticulously curated photos from a yacht in the Maldives or a private villa in Santorini. I used that silence to my absolute advantage. I threw myself into my forensic accounting work during the day, analyzing legitimate corporate mergers and exposing corporate embezzlement for my Chicago clients. But the moment the clock struck 6, I locked my office door, opened my encrypted laptop, and shifted my entire focus to my new personal project. I began mapping the intricate, deeply flawed financial ecosystem surrounding Terrence and his supposedly elite investment fund. I pulled every piece of publicly available data I could legally access. I scoured state business registries, cross-referenced property records, and analyzed federal tax liens. I built a massive digital corkboard linking Terrence to a web of vaguely named limited liability companies registered in states with notoriously lax corporate transparency laws. The more I dug into his professional history, the more the glamorous facade began to peel away. The numbers simply did not add up. A fund manager boasting guaranteed double-digit returns should have clear SEC filings, a robust roster of institutional clients, and an office address that was not a virtual mail drop in Delaware. Despite the glaring red flags, I kept my findings strictly to myself. I knew that confronting my family with mere suspicions would only result in them branding me as a jealous, bitter sibling trying to ruin Madison's newfound happiness. I needed ironclad, undeniable proof before I made a single move. I needed a catalyst. I just did not expect that catalyst to present itself in the form of an incredibly audacious phone call. It was a Thursday evening, exactly 3 weeks after the wedding I was banned from attending. I was sitting on the balcony of my Lake Geneva property, nursing a glass of red wine and watching the sun dip below the pristine Wisconsin water. I had purchased this lake house a year ago after saving aggressively for an entire decade. It was a stunning modern architectural masterpiece featuring floor-to-ceiling windows, a private deep-water dock, and enough luxury amenities to rival a five-star resort. It was my sanctuary, the one place where I could completely escape the high-pressure environment of downtown Chicago. My phone buzzed on the patio table. I glanced at the glowing screen and felt my heart skip a sudden erratic beat. The caller ID displayed my sister's name, Madison. For a brief, foolish second, the deeply buried older sister inside me wondered if she was calling to apologize. Perhaps the guilt of excluding me from the most important day of her life had finally caught up with her. I swiped the screen and answered the call, keeping my voice entirely neutral as I said hello. "Lauren, oh my gosh, it is so good to hear your voice," Madison shrieked into the speaker. Her tone was dripping with a sickeningly sweet artificial enthusiasm. It sounded exactly like the voice she used when speaking to retail workers before demanding to see a manager. "I have missed you so much. Things have been absolutely crazy lately with settling into married life, but I have been meaning to call my favorite sister all week." I sat frozen in my patio chair. She had completely bypassed the fact that she had just hosted a $200,000 destination wedding without me. There was no apology. There was no explanation. There was not even a fleeting acknowledgement of the massive elephant-sized betrayal standing between us. She was operating under the delusion that our relationship was perfectly normal, relying on my historical tendency to simply absorb family disrespect and keep the peace. I did not take the bait. I did not ask about the wedding or the honeymoon. I just asked her what she wanted. Her overly enthusiastic tone faltered for a fraction of a second before recovering. "You are always so straight to business, Lauren. I love that about you. So here's the thing. Terrence is putting together a massive, highly exclusive VIP investor retreat for his fund next weekend. He has some incredibly powerful billionaires flying in from New York and Silicon Valley. He needs a location that screams old money and elite luxury. We were looking at renting a private estate, but then I remembered your gorgeous place up in Lake Geneva. The sheer audacity of the request hit me with the force of a physical blow. She had banned me from her wedding because my pragmatic lifestyle supposedly did not fit her elite image. Yet here she was, 3 weeks later, demanding to use the multi-million-dollar luxury property I had purchased with my own pragmatic hard-earned money to prop up her husband's business pitch. It is the absolute perfect venue. Madison continued her words, tumbling out in a rushed, desperate cadence. Terrence wants to host a private dinner on your dock and do a whole presentation in your great room. We just need you to drop the keys off with Mom and Dad by tomorrow. You do not even have to be there, Lauren. In fact, it would be much better if Terrence and I just hosted it ourselves to keep the professional vibe intact. We promise to leave the place spotless. I listened to the absolute delusion pouring through the phone. She was not just asking for a favor, she was demanding the use of my most valuable asset while explicitly telling me I was not welcome to attend the event being hosted inside my own home. But beneath her demanding, entitled tone, my forensic instincts caught something else. I heard genuine vibrating panic. Why was a supposedly ultra-wealthy fund manager scrambling to secure a free venue at the last possible minute? If Terrence was managing billions of dollars, he could easily rent a luxury compound anywhere in the country. He would not be sending his new wife to beg her estranged sister for a free house. They were completely out of cash. The wedding had bled them dry, and Terrence desperately needed new investors to keep his sinking ship afloat. Madison paused her rapid-fire pitch, waiting for my usual compliant response. So can you drop the keys off tomorrow morning? Terrence is really stressed about this, and I told him my big sister would definitely save the day. I took a slow, deep breath of the crisp lake air. I thought about the hospital bill they refused to help me with. I thought about the wedding photos hidden from my view. I thought about the absolute lack of respect they had shown me my entire life. No, I said. The single ice-cold syllable hung in the air. Excuse me, Madison asked, her voice dropping the sweet facade instantly. What do you mean, no, Lauren? This is for your brother-in-law's career. You have a massive house just sitting there empty. Do not be selfish. I did not offer an excuse. I did not justify my decision. I did not engage in an argument about family loyalty with a woman who had demonstrated she had none. I just pressed the red button on my screen and ended the call. I set the phone face down on the glass table, took another sip of my wine, and smiled. I knew the rejection would be treated as an act of war, but I was fully prepared for the battle. Less than 60 seconds after I pressed the red button, my phone screen illuminated the darkening patio. The family group chat, ironically named Family First, exploded into an absolute war zone. It was a digital blitzkrieg of pure vitriol. My mother, Patricia, fired the opening salvo. She typed in rapid, aggressive all caps, demanding to know how I could be so incredibly cruel to my own flesh and blood. She accused me of trying to sabotage Madison's new marriage out of pure, unadulterated jealousy. She claimed my sensible, pragmatic lifestyle had clearly hardened my heart to the point of sociopathy. According to her, I was punishing Madison simply because I had failed to secure a wealthy husband of my own. My father, Richard, quickly joined the fray. His messages were meticulously structured, resembling the harsh corporate reprimands he used to deliver before his retirement. He called me a bitter, isolated woman who lacked any understanding of high society networking. He stated that real families make substantial sacrifices for one another to build a lasting legacy. He typed these words while entirely ignoring the fact that they had sacrificed my presence at a major life event for a superficial aesthetic. Madison chimed in next with a barrage of texts, claiming she was currently experiencing a severe panic attack on her pristine hardwood floors. She accused me of actively wanting Terrence to fail. I sat on my balcony watching the hostile notifications cascade down my glowing screen. I did not type a single letter in response. I took a slow sip of my wine and analyzed the situation. As a forensic accountant, I am rigorously trained to look past the loud surface noise and identify the underlying truth hidden in the data. This level of frantic, unhinged anger was not just about a bruised family ego. This was pure, unadulterated financial panic. A multi-million-dollar investment fund manager does not have a panic attack over a rejected venue unless that venue is the absolute last lifeline keeping him out of federal prison. They were drowning in deep water, and my luxury lake house was the only piece of driftwood in sight. Then a new notification appeared on my screen. It was not a message in the chaotic group chat. It was a direct text from an unfamiliar New York area code. The sender identified himself immediately. It was Terrence. He was texting me from his official corporate number. His tone was drastically different from the hysterical weeping of my sister or the angry reprimands of my parents. He attempted to sound like a seasoned corporate attorney, delivering a final devastating warning. Terrence wrote that he was severely disappointed by my blatant lack of familial cooperation. He tried to dazzle and intimidate me with a barrage of high-level financial vocabulary. He claimed that hosting his VIP investors at my Lake Geneva property was a matter of urgent fiduciary duty to his firm. He actually dared to use the fabricated term implied family obligations, suggesting that because I was Madison's sister, I had a moral and quasi-legal responsibility to support his corporate endeavors. He threatened that my refusal to hand over the keys could result in massive financial damages for his fund. He strongly implied that I could be held liable for tortious interference and obstructing his critical business operations. The sheer unbridled arrogance of his message was almost comical. He was trying to bully a licensed financial investigator using fabricated legal jargon he likely copied from a television script. He assumed I was just a naive, jealous sister who would cower at the mention of fiduciary duty and corporate liability. He had absolutely no idea that I spent my days tearing apart fraudulent financial statements and putting arrogant men exactly like him behind bars. His text message did not intimidate me in the slightest. It provided me with a massive, glaring red flag. A legitimate fund manager managing billions of dollars does not text his sister-in-law from a corporate device to beg for a free house and threaten her with imaginary legal action. This was the desperate flailing of a cornered criminal trying to project power he did not possess. The group chat continued to vibrate relentlessly against the glass patio table. My mother sent a long message stating that if I did not hand over the keys by tomorrow morning, I would no longer be considered a part of their family. My father added that I would be entirely cut out of their will. That was a completely hollow threat considering I already knew they had secretly drained their retirement assets to fund a fake billionaire's wedding. Madison sent a dramatic voice memo, her manufactured sobs echoing through the speaker begging me to stop ruining her perfect life. I listened to the entire voice memo with a completely steady heart. I looked out over the calm, dark waters of Lake Geneva. The contrast between the peaceful environment I had built for myself and the toxic chaos they were trying to drag me into was striking. I picked up my phone. I opened the settings for the family group chat. I tapped the red button to leave the conversation entirely. I then went to my contact list. I selected my mother's number and hit block. I selected my father's number and hit block. I selected Madison's number and hit block. Finally, I opened the threatening text message from Terrence. I took a high-resolution screenshot of his absurd legal threats, saving it directly to my encrypted investigative folder. Then I blocked his corporate number as well. The digital silence that followed was profoundly beautiful. In less than 5 minutes, I had systematically severed every single tie to the toxic people who had spent my entire life making me feel inadequate. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I felt an overwhelming sense of liberation. I walked back inside my luxury lake house, locked the heavy mahogany door, and opened my laptop. The emotional family drama was officially over. The clinical surgical destruction of Terrence's fraudulent financial empire was about to begin. I knew they would not stop at text messages. Desperate people do desperate things, and my security cameras were already fully operational. For exactly 48 hours, my digital block held strong. I spent those 2 days inside my high-rise Chicago office entirely disconnected from the emotional chaos of my family. I channeled every ounce of my energy into dissecting the limited public financial footprints left by Terrence and his supposedly elite investment fund. The silence from my parents and my sister was absolute. They had no way to reach my personal phone, and my corporate gatekeepers were instructed to reject any calls from unknown numbers. I felt an unprecedented level of peace. I slept through the night for the first time since learning about the hidden Hamptons wedding. However, my professional instincts kept me on high alert. You do not back a desperate financial criminal into a corner and expect them to simply walk away. Terrence had promised his billionaire investors a luxury retreat at my Lake Geneva property. He had likely already sent out the engraved invitations with my address printed boldly on the front. Canceling the event meant admitting failure, exposing his lack of liquidity, and risking a massive investor exodus. Desperation breeds spectacular mistakes. I just had to wait for him to make his move. The validation of my theory arrived exactly at 2:14 on a Saturday morning. I was sound asleep in my downtown Chicago apartment when the harsh pulsating alarm of my smart home security application pierced the quiet darkness of my bedroom. I jolted awake, my heart hammering against my ribs. I grabbed my phone from the nightstand. The screen glowed bright red, displaying an urgent push notification from my property management system. Motion detected at Lake Geneva Estate. Primary entrance breach attempted. I immediately swiped the notification to open the live high-definition infrared camera feeds. The security system I installed at the lake house was military-grade, designed to protect the high-value art and electronics inside. The crisp black and white night vision footage loaded instantly. I stared at the glowing screen of my smartphone, my breath catching in my throat. There, standing on the expansive mahogany front porch of my multi-million-dollar sanctuary, were three distinct figures. The infrared cameras illuminated their faces with perfect clarity. The first figure was my sister Madison. She was pacing frantically near the stone pillars, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, constantly looking over her shoulder toward the dark, empty street. She was not wearing her usual designer brands. She was dressed in dark, inconspicuous clothing, completely out of character for a woman obsessed with elite aesthetics. The second figure was Terrence, the flashy, confident investment fund manager who had just hosted a $200,000 wedding, was now acting like a common street thief. He was standing directly in front of my custom smart lock, illuminating the keypad with the harsh light of a tactical flashlight. He looked agitated, aggressively gesturing toward the heavy wooden door. The third figure was a stranger holding a heavy canvas tool bag, a hired locksmith. Terrence was paying a professional to illegally bypass my commercial-grade deadbolts in the middle of the night. I watched in absolute disbelief as the locksmith pulled an electronic bypass tool from his bag. This was no longer a petty family dispute over a weekend venue. This was not a misunderstanding or a breach of social etiquette. My sister and her new husband were actively committing a felony. They were orchestrating a coordinated illegal break-in. They were crossing the line into criminal trespassing and attempted burglary. My professional training as a forensic investigator immediately took over. I pressed the record button on my security application, capturing the live video feed directly to my encrypted cloud server. I watched Terrence lean in close to the locksmith, clearly barking urgent orders. Madison kept checking her phone, her body language screaming raw panic. They were not trying to sneak in for a vacation. They looked like fugitives trying to secure a hideout. My thumb hovered over the emergency dispatch button built into the security application. A single tap would immediately route a high-priority alert to the Walworth County Sheriff Department. The police station was less than 5 miles from my property. Squad cars could be flying up my private driveway in under 8 minutes. Madison and Terrence would be caught red-handed, surrounded by local law enforcement with a hired locksmith actively tampering with my front door. The scandal would be instantaneous. The arrest records would be public. Their flawless high society image would be instantly incinerated. I pressed the button. The screen transitioned to the emergency dialing interface. The phone began to ring. 1 ring, 2 rings. Walworth County Emergency Dispatch. What is your location? The operator answered, her voice crisp and alert. I opened my mouth to report the active burglary at my address. I was ready to give them the gate code and the descriptions of the perpetrators. But right at that exact moment, a massive wave of forensic intuition hit me with the force of a physical blow. I looked back at the live video feed. Terrence was wiping sweat from his forehead despite the freezing night air. He looked terrified. The absolute undeniable terror radiating from his body language stopped me cold. I hung up the phone. I abruptly ended the emergency call right as the dispatcher spoke again. My mind was racing, connecting disparate data points at lightning speed. Why would an ultra-wealthy fund manager risk a felony arrest just to secure a party venue? If he was truly managing billions, he could easily rent a luxury hotel. A legitimate businessman does not commit a late-night break in just to save face with investors. This was about desperate, immediate survival. If I sent the police right now, Terrence and Madison would be arrested for simple trespassing. They would easily post bail, and the deeper financial crime would remain hidden. I saved the video file. I sat at my sleek glass desk as the sun began to rise over the Chicago skyline, casting long shadows across my apartment. I had not slept a single minute. Adrenaline pumped through my veins, sharpening my focus to a razor edge. I brewed a pot of incredibly strong black coffee and cracked my knuckles. It was time to tear Terrence and his flashy investment fund completely apart. I booted up my encrypted workstation and bypassed the standard search engines. When you hunt financial predators for a living, you do not use regular browsers. You use specialized databases that track global asset transfers, offshore tax havens, and hidden corporate registries. Terrence operated a firm he called Vanguard Elite Holdings. The public-facing website was a masterpiece of corporate deception. It featured high-resolution stock footage of soaring glass skyscrapers, vague mission statements about proprietary algorithmic trading strategies, and bold promises of guaranteed double-digit returns, regardless of market volatility. That last detail made me laugh out loud in the absolute silence of my apartment. Guaranteed returns are the ultimate financial fairy tale. Any legitimate wealth manager knows the market fluctuates aggressively. Only a liar guarantees constant unbending profit. I started my hunt by pulling Vanguard Elite Holdings through the Delaware Division of Corporations database. The firm was registered just 3 years ago. The registered agent was not a prestigious law firm, but a notoriously cheap commercial mail receiving agency. It was a literal post office box, located in a dilapidated strip mall. I needed to see the actual money, not just the corporate shell. I accessed a subscription-based financial intelligence tool I use for corporate audits. I began tracing the public regulatory filings associated with Terrence and his board of directors. A legitimate fund managing billions of dollars is required to file highly detailed forms with the Securities and Exchange Commission. Terrence had filed the absolute bare minimum, taking advantage of obscure exemptions designed for small, private advisors. He was intentionally operating in total darkness. I pulled heavily on that thread. I cross-referenced the names of his supposed executive officers. They were ghosts. Two of the names belonged to individuals who had been dead for over a decade. Another was linked to a disbarred attorney currently living in a notorious tax haven. Terrence had fabricated an entire executive board to make his operation look robust and heavily staffed. The deeper I dug, the more the glamorous facade rotted away. I utilized a specialized asset tracing program to follow the digital breadcrumbs of his corporate bank accounts. Terrence was not running a sophisticated algorithmic trading desk. He had constructed a dizzying, incredibly fragile labyrinth of shell companies. Money would flow into Vanguard Elite Holdings from a new investor sit in the primary account for less than 48 hours, and then immediately fracture into dozens of smaller wire transfers. I tracked those rapid transfers. They did not go to Wall Street clearinghouses or legitimate trading platforms. They were routed through a series of anonymous limited liability companies registered in Nevada, Wyoming, and eventually to offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands and the Bahamas. This is a classic layering technique used by money launderers to obscure the true destination of funds. But I am an expert at dismantling these exact criminal structures. By noon, I had successfully pierced the corporate veil. I managed to reconstruct a partial ledger of his incoming and outgoing transactions over the past 18 months. The data painted a picture so horrifying, I actually felt a brief chill run down my spine. The money flowing out of the offshore accounts was not generating any legitimate investment yield. It was being directly funneled back into the primary United States accounts to pay off the early investors. Terrence was running a textbook catastrophic Ponzi scheme. I was constantly shuffling money from new victims to satisfy the withdrawal requests of older victims, creating the absolute illusion of massive, consistent profitability. But the math was entirely unsustainable. The incoming investments were drastically slowing down. The outgoing dividend payments were accelerating at a terrifying pace. The entire financial pyramid was balancing on the edge of a razor blade mere moments away from a spectacular, devastating collapse. Then the final piece of the puzzle clicked perfectly into place. I looked at the ledger entries from the past 60 days. I saw massive panicked withdrawals from the corporate accounts being routed directly into personal accounts managed by Terrence and my sister. These were the exact funds used to pay for the $200,000 Hamptons destination wedding. The wedding was not a celebration of love. It was a highly calculated, desperately executed marketing stunt. Terrence knew his fraudulent fund was bleeding cash. He desperately needed to project an image of unstoppable success to lure in a fresh batch of ultra-wealthy victims. He needed to surround himself with billionaires, feed them imported caviar, and pour them premium champagne so they would blindly trust him with their extensive portfolios. I used my parents' desperate need for high society status to legitimize his criminal operation. My sister Madison was not just a naive bride. She was the glamorous bait in a multi-million-dollar financial trap. And my parents were the foolish, arrogant accomplices who willingly helped build the stage. This realization explained the midnight break-in perfectly. The expensive wedding stunt had failed to generate enough new capital to keep the Ponzi scheme afloat. Terrence was completely out of cash and desperate to host another VIP pitch event. He could not afford to rent a venue, so he tried to steal access to my luxury lake house. I leaned back in my chair and looked at the massive digital web of fraud displayed across my dual monitors. Terrence thought he was a mastermind untouchable by the law. My family thought they had finally bought their way into the upper echelon of American wealth. They had absolutely no idea that a forensic accountant with a flawless track record was currently packaging their entire fraudulent lives into an impenetrable federal dossier. I reached for my keyboard and began drafting my official whistleblower report for the FBI. My fingers flew across the mechanical keys, meticulously outlining the offshore routing accounts and shell corporations Terrence used to launder his investors' capital. The silence of my Chicago apartment was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic clacking of my typing. I was deep into assembling the evidence regarding the $200,000 Hamptons wedding fraud when a sharp, distinct chime echoed from my secondary monitor. It was not my standard email notification. It was a high-priority encrypted alert from the premium title monitoring service I had contracted the very day I closed on my Lake Geneva property. In my specialized line of work, you learn very quickly that physical assets are never entirely safe from digital predators. I pay a substantial annual fee to ensure that if anyone even attempts to run a credit check against my property deed, I am notified in real time. I immediately minimized the federal reporting portal and opened the alert. The subject line glowed in stark red text, indicating a severe status change on my real estate parcel. A massive active lien had just been recorded with the Walworth County Clerk. My heart slammed aggressively against my ribs. I quickly logged into the secure county database using my professional forensic credentials. I bypassed the delayed public search portal and went straight into the raw, unedited filing system. I pulled the digital scan of the newly filed legal document. It was a commercial promissory note. A hard money lender based out of a notoriously shady office park in Las Vegas had just issued a short-term, extremely high-interest loan for exactly $2 million. The collateral listed on the loan was my Lake Geneva sanctuary. The interest rate was a predatory 25%. This was a highly toxic death spiral loan. It was the exact type of financial instrument desperate people use when they have completely exhausted every legitimate banking option and maxed out their hidden credit lines. If a single monthly payment was missed, the lender had the absolute legal right to seize the property within 30 days. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together. Terrence was completely out of capital. His Ponzi scheme was collapsing so fast that he resorted to borrowing dirty money at loan shark rates just to keep the illusion alive for one more month. He needed massive liquidity instantly to pay off the angry investors demanding their quarterly returns. But a hard money lender requires a physical asset to secure the cash. Terrence did not own a single piece of viable real estate, so he decided to steal my multi-million-dollar house. I stared at the high-definition screen, my analytical mind racing, to comprehend the exact mechanics of the theft. You cannot simply mortgage a property you do not legally own. The underwriter requires a verified notarized signature from the deed holder. I scrolled down to the second page of the scanned PDF to review the authorization signatures. I expected to see a crude forgery of my own name. What I saw instead made the blood completely freeze in my veins. Attached to the promissory note was a fabricated power of attorney document. It legally granted my sister Madison full executive control over my real estate assets. The document explicitly claimed I was mentally incapacitated and had transferred all my financial decision-making rights directly to her. Madison had actually signed the loan agreement on my behalf. She had pledged my home to a Las Vegas loan shark to fund her husband's criminal enterprise. But the ultimate soul-crushing betrayal was not Madison's signature. A power of attorney document requires an official notary public and two independent legal witnesses to verify the identity and consent of the person transferring their power. The notary stamp belonged to a disgraced local attorney I instantly recognized from a previous financial fraud audit. That was easily explained by a fast cash bribe. The witness signatures were a different story entirely. I zoomed in on the bottom of the digital document. There, written in crisp blue ink, were two signatures I had known my entire life. The first belonged to my father, Richard. The second belonged to my mother, Patricia. My own parents had legally witnessed and sworn under penalty of perjury that I had willingly signed away my property rights to my sister. They had actively participated in a massive coordinated real estate fraud. They had literally handed my home over to a criminal just to keep up the appearance of Madison's flawless high society marriage. I sat back in my chair and let the sheer magnitude of their crime wash over me. This was no longer a toxic family dynamic characterized by simple favoritism. This was a coordinated criminal conspiracy. By signing that fraudulent document, Richard and Patricia had crossed the line from enabling parents into federal co-conspirators. They had committed identity theft, wire fraud, and mortgage fraud. They had risked sending themselves to a federal penitentiary just to protect a man they had known for less than 2 years. The layers of their deception were entirely staggering. When they denied my request for a medical loan last year, they claimed they had absolutely no assets. Now, to protect Terrence, they were perfectly willing to steal my assets. They saw my hard work, my financial stability, and my independence not as accomplishments to be proud of, but as a convenient piggy bank they could smash open to fund Madison's extravagant lifestyle. They viewed me as nothing more than a collateral damage casualty in their desperate quest for social status. I did not feel sadness. I did not feel the sting of a daughter realizing her parents never loved her. I felt an exhilarating razor-sharp sense of absolute power. My family thought they had successfully outsmarted me. They assumed I would not notice the lien until the foreclosure notices arrived in the mail months from now. They vastly underestimated my paranoia, my professional expertise, and my relentless dedication to protecting my own assets. I leaned forward and began printing high-resolution color copies of the forged power of attorney and the predatory loan agreement. The heavy-duty office printer whirred to life, spitting out the physical evidence of their impending destruction. I collated the pages carefully and placed them into a sleek black leather portfolio. It was Sunday morning. In exactly 4 hours, my parents would be hosting their traditional Sunday dinner at their Winnetka home. Madison and Terrence would undoubtedly be there, sipping expensive wine and celebrating their sudden influx of $2 million in stolen cash. They would be toasting to their own brilliance, completely secure in the belief that their elite image was safe. I checked the silver watch on my wrist. I walked into my bedroom and selected a tailored charcoal gray suit. I dressed with meticulous precision, ensuring every detail projected absolute authority. I was not going to their house as a rejected daughter seeking a tearful apology. I was walking into their dining room as the lead investigator of their financial execution. I picked up the black leather portfolio from my desk. I locked my apartment door securely behind me. I was going to completely ruin their Sunday dinner. The drive from downtown Chicago to the affluent suburb of Winnetka took exactly 40 minutes. I did not turn on the radio. The silence inside my sensible sedan was absolute, matching the freezing calculation currently running through my veins. Every passing mile stripped away the last remaining threads of familial obligation I held for the people waiting at the end of my route. They had crossed a boundary that could never be uncrossed. By the time I pulled into the sweeping, circular driveway of my parents' sprawling estate, my emotional detachment was complete. I parked directly behind Terrence's leased luxury sports car, completely blocking him in. I wanted to make sure nobody could run away from the confrontation that was about to unfold. I walked up the manicured stone pathway, gripping the black leather portfolio tightly in my right hand. The heavy oak front door was unlocked, a typical sign of their arrogant suburban security. I pushed it open without knocking. The scent of roasted garlic and expensive red wine wafted through the grand foyer. From the formal dining room down the hall, I could hear the distinct sound of clinking crystal glasses and boisterous self-congratulatory laughter. Terrence was holding court. I followed the noise, my heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floors with the measured rhythm of a ticking clock. I stepped into the dining room archway and paused. The scene before me was a masterpiece of manufactured high society bliss. My father sat at the head of the long mahogany table carving a massive prime rib. My mother was pouring a vintage Cabernet Sauvignon into tall crystal glasses. Madison and Terrence sat close together, dressed in designer clothing that they had undoubtedly purchased using the stolen funds from my lake house. Terrence was mid-sentence, loudly bragging about a fictional real estate acquisition in Dubai. I stepped fully into the room. The grand dining space went completely dead silent. My mother froze with the wine bottle suspended mid-air. My father lowered his carving knife, his face instantly flushing with defensive anger. Madison let out a sharp gasp, instinctively grabbing Terrence by the arm. Terrence just stared at me, his arrogant smirk melting into a look of distinct, terrified recognition. They all knew exactly why I was there. They just did not know the sheer volume of ammunition I had brought with me. I did not offer a polite greeting. I walked straight up to the center of the mahogany table, sweeping a crystal water goblet aside. I slammed the heavy black leather portfolio down onto the polished wood. The sharp, violent smack echoed off the vaulted ceiling. I opened the flap and pulled out the first piece of evidence. I tossed the high-resolution infrared security photos directly onto my father's expensive china plate. The images clearly showed Madison Terrence and their hired locksmith attempting to breach the commercial deadbolts of my Lake Geneva property at 2 o'clock in the morning. I watched my sister's face drain of all color as she stared at the undeniable proof of her attempted burglary. Before any of them could formulate a single lie, I pulled out the second, far more devastating document. I slammed the forged commercial promissory note and the fabricated power of attorney right on top of the prime rib platter. I pointed a steady, accusing finger directly at the bottom of the page. I asked my parents to explain why their signatures were currently sitting on a fraudulent legal document pledging my home to a Las Vegas loan shark. I demanded to know how they could legally swear under penalty of perjury that I had transferred my assets to my sister. I fully expected tears. I anticipated desperate, groveling apologies. I prepared myself for my mother to collapse into theatrical sobs and beg for my forgiveness. What actually happened was infinitely worse, and it cemented my absolute disgust for the people who raised me. My father did not apologize. He picked up his linen napkin, calmly wiped his hands, and leaned back in his chair. He looked at me with cold, unwavering defiance. He told me to lower my voice and stop acting like a hysterical child. He openly admitted to signing the document, claiming it was a necessary family business decision to protect his son-in-law. My mother aggressively chimed in, defending the forgery with breathtaking delusion. She argued that Terrence was on the verge of securing a massive billion-dollar international investment deal. She claimed he merely needed a temporary liquidity bridge to finalize the paperwork and secure their elite future. She looked me dead in the eye and stated that I had plenty of money sitting in my bank accounts. She called me incredibly selfish for hoarding a luxury vacation home, while my brother-in-law was fighting to build a generational empire for our family. She actually had the nerve to suggest I should be grateful to contribute to their success. Madison quickly adopted the role of the victim. She dramatically placed a hand over her chest and accused me of being a ruthless, unfeeling machine. She said I was trying to sabotage her marriage because I was jealous of her lavish lifestyle and her perfect husband. She cried fake tears demanding I stop trying to ruin her happiness with boring legal technicalities. Terrence regained his arrogant posture, sneering at me from across the table. He leaned forward, attempting to mansplain financial strategy to a certified forensic accountant. He told me the loan was perfectly safe and would be paid off in 3 weeks, completely ignoring the fact that he had committed federal wire fraud and identity theft to secure it. He told me to relax and let the real business professionals handle the big money. I stood there looking at the four of them, and a profound realization washed over my entire being. They were completely irredeemable. They felt absolutely zero remorse for stealing my property, violating my trust, and risking federal prison time. They genuinely believed that their fake social status and superficial wealth were far more important than my financial security or my legal rights. They viewed my success not as something to be celebrated, but as a resource to be aggressively plundered whenever they needed cash. I did not scream. I did not flip the table. I did not threaten to call the police right then and there. As a financial investigator, I know that warning a criminal only gives them time to destroy evidence and hide their assets. I needed them to feel completely safe. I needed them to believe they had successfully bullied me into submission, so they would confidently walk right into the trap I was about to set. I gathered the original documents, leaving the copies scattered across their ruined dinner. I looked at my father and told him he was absolutely right. I told him family legacy required sacrifice and understanding. I softened my posture, intentionally fabricating a look of reluctant defeat. I told Terrence I would not report the forgery to the authorities provided we put a few protective legal measures in place for the upcoming investor retreat. My family instantly relaxed their arrogant smiles, returning as they assumed they had won another battle against me. They happily went back to drinking their expensive wine, completely blind to the reality of the situation. They had no idea they had just sealed their own spectacular doom. I told Terrence I would not contact the authorities about the forged power of attorney. I promised to keep the police out of our business. I told my sister she could have full access to the Lake Geneva property for the upcoming VIP investor retreat. Madison shrieked with delight, completely forgetting the malicious insults she had hurled at me minutes prior. She attempted to hug me. I subtly stepped back, avoiding her physical touch under the guise of organizing the legal files. Terrence loudly boasted my cooperation would guarantee his fund an influx of $50 million by the end of the month. He promised to buy me champagne once his deals closed. The delusion was suffocating, but I maintained my mask of quiet compliance. I reached into my portfolio and pulled out a stapled stack of crisp white paper. I placed the thick document on the table next to the ruined prime rib. I told Terrence that since he was hosting a corporate event at my private residence, my insurance provider required a standard liability waiver. I explained it was a basic formality designed to protect me from premises liability if one of his wealthy investors happened to slip and fall on the boat dock. The explanation sounded incredibly boring and entirely routine. It was the exact type of bureaucratic nonsense arrogant people ignore. But the document resting on the table was not a standard insurance form. I spent 6 hours drafting it with the help of a ruthless corporate litigator. It was a flawless, legally impenetrable contract designed to strip my family of every single legal defense they possessed. Buried beneath dense, mind-numbing legal boilerplate were several lethal clauses. The first clause required the signatories to explicitly acknowledge that the $2 million hard money loan was secured using fraudulent representations. By signing, Madison and my parents were legally admitting to the forgery in writing. The second clause completely indemnified me from any financial losses, debts, or federal penalties incurred by Vanguard Elite Holdings. The third clause was a total forfeiture of rights, explicitly stating that Richard, Patricia, and Madison surrendered any future claims to my financial support, real estate equity, or personal assets under any circumstances. The final clause mandated that Terrence assume absolute personal liability for all corporate fraud, shielding the property owner from asset seizure by federal authorities. It was a financial death warrant disguised as a slip and fall waiver. I handed a silver pen to Terrence. I told him I needed all 4 signatures to satisfy the insurance underwriters before handing over the digital access codes to the lake house. A cautious, intelligent business manager would have demanded his legal counsel review a 40-page document before signing it. But Terrence was not an intelligent manager. He was a desperate, cornered fraudster blinded by his own narcissism. He scoffed at the thick stack of paper complaining about red tape. He did not read a single paragraph. He did not even scan the bolded section headers. He flipped straight to the final page and aggressively scrawled his signature across the dotted line. He passed the pen to Madison. My sister, eager to secure her luxury venue, signed her name with a flourish, completely oblivious to the fact she was documenting her own felony. My father took the pen next. He gave me a stern look, reminding me that family always protects family, completely missing the irony that he was signing a document that would absolutely destroy him. He signed his name with firm, confident strokes. My mother did not even look at the paper. She was too busy texting her country club friends about the upcoming elite investor retreat. She blindly signed her name at the very bottom, officially completing the trap. I carefully collected the document, ensuring all 4 signatures were clearly legible. I slid the lethal contract back into my black leather portfolio and zipped it shut. I pulled out a business card containing the master access codes, the gate pass, and the security deactivation sequence for the Lake Geneva estate. I handed the card to Terrence. He snatched it from my fingers with a victorious grin. I told them I had a busy week ahead and would stay entirely out of their way. My father nodded approvingly, telling me I was finally learning my proper place. My mother did not say goodbye. She was loudly discussing expensive catering options with Madison. I turned and walked out of the grand dining room. I stepped into the crisp evening air, walked down the manicured stone pathway, and got into my sensible sedan. As I pulled out of the long circular driveway, I looked at the dark windows of their opulent suburban mansion one last time. The burning anger had completely dissipated, replaced by a cold, methodical focus. I drove back to my downtown Chicago apartment, knowing my plan was executing flawlessly. I had the confession. I had the financial ledgers. Terrence was walking straight into an active surveillance grid. The trap was perfectly set. The bait was taken. Now I wait. Saturday morning provided the perfect picturesque backdrop for a high-stakes financial con. Around 10 o'clock, sleek black vehicles began snaking up my long private driveway. Luxury SUVs deposited dozens of exceptionally wealthy individuals onto my front porch. These were older men in tailored casual wear, tech entrepreneurs, and seasoned venture capitalists. They stepped out and immediately admired the sweeping views of the pristine Wisconsin water. Terrence greeted them at the heavy mahogany door, shaking hands and projecting the ultimate image of an unstoppable financial titan. Madison stood right beside him, holding a crystal flute of champagne and flashing a perfectly practiced, dazzling smile. They had absolutely no idea that my sanctuary was wired for comprehensive security. I had hidden microphones embedded in the smart home hubs, wide-angle cameras disguised as motion sensors, and audio receivers positioned near the vaulted ceiling. I sat alone in my office staring at 4 large monitors. I wore noise-canceling headphones capturing every single word spoken inside my property. The audio was crystal clear. I heard the clinking of glassware, the laughter of billionaires, and the smooth lies slipping from my brother-in-law. Shortly after lunch, Terrence ushered his VIP guests into my expansive living room. He stood in front of my massive stone fireplace, flanked by digital boards displaying manipulated architectural renderings. He began his pitch. He spoke with undeniable charisma, commanding the room with the confidence of a predator. He detailed a sprawling commercial real estate development supposedly breaking ground in a prime coastal zone. He tossed out phrases like risk-adjusted yields, proprietary acquisition algorithms, and guaranteed preferential equity structures. The investors nodded approvingly, mesmerized by his energetic delivery and the opulence of the surroundings. I listened to his presentation and cross-referenced his claims against my deeply researched corporate database. Every single word was a meticulously crafted fabrication. The coastal development he was pitching did not exist. The municipal zoning permits he claimed to hold were fake. The initial capital he bragged about securing had been drained to pay off his earlier victims and finance his lavish lifestyle. He was soliciting tens of millions of dollars based on a complete ghost project. This was definitive wire fraud, occurring in real time across state lines. He used electronic communications and banking infrastructure to execute a federal crime, upgrading his local offenses into massive federal felonies. While Terrence spun his web of lies, my hands flew across my keyboard. I had a split screen open, accessing the encrypted whistleblower submission portals for both the Securities and Exchange Commission and the FBI. I uploaded the final pieces of the puzzle. I attached the forged title deed bearing my parents' signatures. I uploaded the predatory loan agreement. I attached the bank routing numbers tracing his offshore money laundering network. I included high-resolution screenshots of his fake executives and the dead individuals listed on his board. Finally, I uploaded the live audio and video files of his ongoing fraudulent pitch. The federal reporting system requires absolute clarity. I structured the executive summary to hit every single critical keyword required to trigger an immediate high-priority task force response. I highlighted the imminent threat of massive capital flight. I emphasized that the perpetrator was currently soliciting new funds from high-net-worth individuals using stolen assets as a backdrop. I flagged the involvement of the Las Vegas loan shark, connecting Terrence to organized financial crime syndicates. My documentation was a flawless lethal weapon forged from undeniable data. It left zero room for interpretation and absolutely no margin for error. On the camera feed, I spotted my parents, Richard and Patricia. They were circulating among the wealthy guests, handing out appetizers and acting like elite socialites. My mother was loudly boasting to a Silicon Valley executive about Terrence managing the family wealth. My father was patting Terrence on the back, playing the role of the proud patriarch. They were completely blinded by their desperation for social status. They had willingly committed identity theft and real estate fraud, legally chaining themselves to a sinking ship just to impress a room full of strangers. I felt a surge of cold satisfaction, knowing they had signed my liability waiver, stripping themselves of any legal defense when the authorities inevitably arrived. Every financial claim was backed by hard banking evidence. The trap was fully loaded. I clicked the final submission button on the FBI portal. The screen flashed a confirmation message generating a unique tracking case number. I immediately switched tabs and submitted the identical dossier to the SEC Enforcement Division. The digital files flew through the secure encrypted servers. The point of no return was officially crossed. I looked back at the live video feed. Terrence was wrapping up his fraudulent presentation, asking the wealthy investors to sign preliminary commitment documents. Madison was pouring champagne, celebrating a victory that would never materialize. They thought they had won. They believed their extravagant lies had successfully secured their future. I closed my laptop and locked it inside my desk drawer. I stood up and carefully straightened my perfectly tailored designer suit jacket. It was time to leave my Chicago office. It was finally time to drive back up to Wisconsin. It was time to look them all directly in the eyes. The drive from downtown Chicago to Lake Geneva usually takes about 90 minutes. I completed the journey in exactly 70. I kept the radio off the entire time, allowing the steady hum of the highway tires to synchronize with my highly focused breathing. I was not nervous. I was operating with the cold, absolute precision of a predator closing in on a highly anticipated kill. When I finally reached the long, winding private road leading up to my estate, I encountered the first physical manifestation of Terrence's extreme delusion. A private valet stand had been illegally erected at the base of my driveway. Two young men in crisp white shirts and black vests rushed forward to open my car door, completely unaware that the woman stepping out of the sensible sedan was the actual legal owner of the multi-million-dollar property they were standing on. I handed over my keys without a single word and bypassed the velvet rope they had set up near my custom stone pathway. I walked up the sweeping driveway, taking a meticulous mental inventory of the luxury vehicles parked illegally on my front lawn. I saw brand new Bentleys, custom Maybachs, and a few imported sports cars glinting sharply in the late afternoon sun. Terrence had successfully gathered some of the deepest pockets in the Midwest. I reached my heavy mahogany front door and pushed it open. The interior of my home had been completely transformed into a high-end corporate showroom. Caterers moved silently through my grand foyer, carrying silver trays of vintage champagne and miniature gourmet appetizers. I ignored them completely. I smoothed the sharp lapels of my tailored charcoal gray suit. The aggressive cut of the fabric and the stark white silk blouse underneath projected absolute, uncompromising authority. I did not look like a jilted, bitter sister crashing a family party. I looked like an executioner arriving to deliver a fatal blow. I walked down the main hallway toward the great room. The deep, booming sound of Terrence's voice echoed off my vaulted ceilings. He was right in the middle of his grand finale. I stood just outside the massive archway, completely hidden in the shadows, and listened to him confidently lie to a room full of seasoned billionaires. He was pacing aggressively in front of my massive stone fireplace, gesturing wildly toward a digital presentation board displaying entirely fake zoning permits. He promised the crowd a guaranteed 20% return within the first fiscal quarter. He rapidly fired off corporate buzzwords like synergistic asset allocation and aggressive market disruption. The wealthy investors were leaning forward in their plush chairs, entirely captivated by his magnetic, highly polished performance. I stepped out of the concealing shadows and walked directly into the center of the great room. My designer heels clicked sharply against the imported hardwood floor, a sudden rhythmic intrusion that immediately shattered the mesmerizing spell Terrence had cast over the room. Several wealthy investors turned their heads, their expressions a mix of mild irritation and distinct curiosity at the unannounced interruption. Terrence froze mid-sentence. His charismatic, winning smile vanished, instantly replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated horror. His hands dropped heavily to his sides. He stared at me with wide, terrified eyes, acting as if a federal agent had just walked through the front door. Madison was standing near my custom wet bar, holding a heavy bottle of imported champagne. When she saw me standing there, she let out a sharp, audible gasp. The expensive champagne bottle slipped right through her trembling fingers and shattered violently against the floor. The loud sound of breaking glass echoed sharply through the massive room, causing every single wealthy investor to turn around and look directly at me. My parents, Richard and Patricia, were seated proudly in the front row, actively trying to mingle with a renowned tech executive. They both shot out of their chairs as if the expensive cushions had suddenly caught fire. My father's face turned an ugly mottled shade of crimson. My mother covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with mounting panic. I did not say a single word to them. I simply stood, radiating absolute control, letting the crushing weight of my physical presence suffocate their elaborate lie. The tension in the room skyrocketed to an unbearable level. The wealthy investors began murmuring urgently among themselves, sensing the sudden aggressive shift in the atmosphere. They could smell the raw panic radiating from their supposed financial guru. Madison completely lost her mind. The carefully crafted facade of an elite, untouchable socialite crumbled into hysterical, frantic desperation. She lunged forward, her voice cracking as she screamed across the quiet room. She pointed a trembling finger directly at my face and ordered me to leave her property immediately. When I did not flinch or retreat, she turned toward the back of the room and shrieked at the top of her lungs for the private security team. Two large men wearing tight black suits and discreet communication earpieces immediately stepped out from the kitchen hallway. They moved swiftly toward me, their faces stern and highly professional. They had been paid handsomely to protect a highly exclusive corporate event, and my sister had just publicly identified me as a hostile, dangerous intruder. Madison screamed at the advancing guards, demanding they physically throw me off the premises immediately. She loudly told the confused, murmuring investors that I was a mentally unstable, estranged family member, actively trying to ruin her husband's brilliant business presentation due to petty jealousy. Terrence finally found his voice attempting to laugh off the disruption to save his pitch, but the sound was choked and utterly desperate. He frantically signaled the guards to hurry up and remove me. The two large men closed in on my position, reaching out their hands to physically grab my arms and drag me out of my own house. I stood extremely firm. I never blinked. I never retreated a single inch. Before the lead security guard could lay a single finger on my tailored jacket, I raised my right hand in a sharp, authoritative gesture that demanded immediate compliance. I reached into the breast pocket of my suit and pulled out a thick, legally binding document bearing the raised, embossed seal of the Walworth County Clerk. I held it up directly in front of the guard's face, ensuring he could clearly read the bold black text at the top of the page. It was the original, certified warranty deed to the Lake Geneva estate proving my absolute legal ownership. I looked the massive security guard dead in the eye and spoke with the cold, measured tone of a woman who completely controlled the board. I informed him that I was the sole legal owner of this massive estate. I told him the man who hired him was actively committing federal fraud and trespassing on my land. I clearly stated that if he or his partner touched me, they would not only lose their private security licenses, but they would be aggressively prosecuted as accomplices to a major federal crime. I fired them both on the spot and ordered them to stand down immediately. The lead guard froze. He was a professional hired to mitigate risk, not incur federal liabilities. He quickly scanned the certified seal on the deed, looked at my unwavering expression, and immediately recognized the raw, undeniable truth. He took a massive step back, lowering his hands and nodding to his partner. The two men pivoted smoothly and walked straight out the front door, completely abandoning their post and leaving Terrence entirely defenseless. A collective gasp rippled through the audience of wealthy investors. The sudden, obedient departure of the security team confirmed to every seasoned billionaire in the room that my presence was not a hysterical intrusion. It was a hostile takeover. Madison was completely paralyzed. The manufactured high society facade she had spent months cultivating completely shattered, revealing the terrified, deeply insecure woman hiding underneath. She opened her mouth to scream another order, but her voice completely failed her. I marched straight past her, my heels echoing sharply against the hardwood floor. I did not even grant her the dignity of a passing glance. My focus was entirely locked on the man sweating profusely at the front of the room. Terrence looked like he was about to physically collapse. The arrogant, untouchable investment fund manager, who had spent the last hour bragging about fake real estate developments, was now trembling very visibly. He clutched the silver microphone so tightly his knuckles were stark white. As I approached the stone fireplace, he actually took a step backward, his expensive custom velvet tuxedo suddenly looking like a cheap costume. I reached out and forcefully ripped the microphone right out of his sweating hand. He did not resist. He was entirely consumed by the blinding panic of a cornered predator, realizing it had just walked into a fatal trap. I stepped up to the polished wooden podium, placing my hands firmly on the edges. I looked out over the crowd of highly influential venture capitalists, tech entrepreneurs, and seasoned corporate executives. I adjusted the microphone stand, completely taking command of the massive great room. The silence was absolute, heavy with extreme anticipation. "Good afternoon, gentlemen," I said, my voice echoing very clearly through the premium audio system Terrence had rented using my stolen credit. "I want to officially welcome you all to my private home. My name is Lauren. I am a licensed forensic accountant, specializing in federal financial crimes, and I am the sole legal owner of the property you are currently sitting inside." The murmurs erupted instantly. Several men in the front row leaned forward, their eyes narrowing with intense, calculated scrutiny. The mood in the room shifted from relaxed luxury to aggressive predatory alert. Billionaires do not appreciate being made fools of, and they were rapidly realizing they had been seated at a table built on lies. I did not give the crowd a chance to interrupt. I raised my hand to command silence, and the room instantly obeyed. I pointed a sharp finger directly at Terence, who was currently trying to shrink into the shadows near the patio doors. I informed the audience that the man standing before them did not own this estate. I revealed that he did not possess a single legitimate deed to any coastal commercial property. I explicitly stated that the municipal zoning permits he had just flashed across the digital presentation boards were entirely fabricated documents designed to illegally separate them from their capital. I declared that Vanguard Elite Holdings was nothing more than a hollow, rotting shell corporation operating out of a dilapidated strip mall mail drop. A powerful Silicon Valley executive in the second row stood up, his face dark with sudden explosive anger. He demanded to know exactly what was going on and why they had been invited to a fraudulent pitch. My father, Richard, suddenly jumped out of his chair, attempting to salvage the catastrophic wreckage of his social climbing ambitions. He frantically waved his arms, shouting at the investors to remain calm. He desperately tried to label me as a disgruntled, estranged daughter, spinning malicious lies to seek revenge for a petty family dispute. He pleaded with the crowd to trust Terence blindly, defending a criminal just to protect his own fabricated status. I looked at my father with absolute, unrelenting disgust. I spoke directly into the microphone, my voice cutting through his pathetic excuses like a serrated blade. I told the room that the man currently yelling at them had actively participated in a massive real estate fraud by signing a forged power of attorney document to illegally secure funding for this exact event. My father choked on his own words, dropping back into his chair as if he had been physically struck. The investors were fully enraged now. They demanded immediate hard proof. I smiled coldly. I raised my left hand and gave a sharp signal toward the main entrance. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. My trusted junior investigator, David, stepped into the great room. He pushed a sleek metal cart stacked high with thick leather-bound dossiers. He moved with precision, grabbing the folders and distributing them directly into the hands of every wealthy investor in the room. The binders landed on the tables and armchairs with authoritative thuds. I leaned into the microphone. I instructed the men in the room to open the red-tabbed section on page 1. I told them they were looking at the raw, unedited banking ledgers for Vanguard Elite Holdings over the past 18 months. The room fell into a terrifying silence as dozens of wealthy men simultaneously flipped open the dossiers and began reading. The rustling of thick paper was the only sound echoing through my vaulted ceilings. I did not let them read in silence. I narrated their financial destruction, ensuring my family heard every agonizing detail. I pointed out specific transaction dates. I explained how Terence utilized a Ponzi structure to create the illusion of massive corporate wealth. I detailed how capital from new investors was held in a Delaware account for less than 48 hours before being aggressively fractured. I showed them routing numbers moving their money through obscure companies in Nevada and Wyoming. The color rapidly drained from the faces of the venture capitalists and tech executives. These men prided themselves on their infallible business instincts, and they were staring at undeniable proof that they had been completely played. A prominent real estate developer aggressively slammed his dossier down onto the nearest table. He demanded to know where the offshore money went. I instructed the room to turn to the blue-tabbed section on page 14. I looked directly at Madison. My sister was trembling violently, her eyes darting toward the exits. I announced that the blue section contained itemized personal spending accounts for the elite fund manager and his new wife. I read the numbers loud and clear. $200,000 wired to Hampton's wedding planners, $50,000 routed to Parisian bridal designers, $75,000 transferred to lease the imported cars parked on my front lawn. I looked right at the Silicon Valley executive who had shouted earlier. I told him the $250,000 deposit he wired last month did not go into a commercial real estate asset. It went directly to paying for the vintage champagne he was holding in his hand. I told him his investment capital bought the custom velvet tuxedo Terence was sweating through. I exposed every extravagant purchase my sister had flaunted on social media. The designer handbags, private yacht rentals, and massive diamond ring were funded by stealing directly from the men standing in this room. The reaction was explosive. Absolute chaos erupted instantly. The room of sophisticated billionaires transformed into a mob of highly aggressive, violently angry victims. Several men pulled out cell phones shouting urgent orders to their legal teams and crisis management firms. The Silicon Valley executive lunged forward, grabbing Terrence by his expensive suit collar. He shoved the fraudulent fund manager against the stone fireplace, screaming profanities and demanding his money back immediately. Terrence threw his hands up in a desperate gesture of surrender. He babbled incoherently, trying to claim the documents were fabricated, but his trembling voice betrayed his absolute guilt. The evidence was certified by federal banking institutions. There was zero room for debate. Madison shrieked in horror as the investors crowded around her husband. She tried to push through the angry crowd to reach Terrence, but an older venture capitalist stepped directly in her path. He pointed a shaking finger at her designer gown, loudly accusing her of wearing stolen money. Madison backed away, her hands covering her face as she sobbed hysterically. She looked wildly around the room, searching for an escape route, but the sheer volume of enraged investors blocked every single exit. The glamorous life she had ruthlessly excluded me from was disintegrating into a highly public nightmare. I stood at the podium and watched the destruction unfold with freezing detachment. I did not feel pity for my brother-in-law. Terrence built a house of cards, using stolen capital and extreme arrogance. He preyed on my family's desperate need for social validation, and he attempted to steal my hard-earned property to keep himself out of federal prison. The furious shouting echoing through my home was the sound of unfiltered justice. Two investors actively blocked the patio doors, ensuring Terrence could not slip away into the backyard. Another man stood guarding the main hallway. They were effectively holding him hostage, securing the perimeter until law enforcement arrived. Terrence slid down the rough stone of the fireplace, collapsing onto the hardwood floor. He pulled his knees to his chest, hiding his face in his hands. The facade of the financial titan was completely gone. He was nothing more than a terrified, cornered criminal waiting for the inevitable consequences of his massive greed. I looked over the sea of angry faces and realized the financial autopsy was perfectly executed. The investors knew the truth. The fund was destroyed. But my work was not finished. The men in this room were not the only ones who enabled this criminal enterprise. I turned away from the sobbing bride and the broken fraudster. I locked my eyes firmly on the front row. My parents were still sitting there, frozen in absolute shock, watching their golden son-in-law get torn apart by his victims. They thought they could remain quiet and avoid the catastrophic fallout. They assumed they could play innocent bystanders, but they were completely wrong. I reached into my black leather portfolio and pulled out the final document. It was finally time to deal with the people who raised me. They were about to lose absolutely everything they ever cared about today. My father Richard finally snapped out of his paralyzed state. The crimson flush of severe embarrassment on his face rapidly mutated into blinding, uncontrolled rage. He shoved his way past a group of furious venture capitalists, dragging my mother Patricia close behind him. They stormed the wooden podium where I stood, their faces twisted into masks of absolute hatred. My mother was practically foaming at the mouth, her perfectly styled hair now disheveled and wild. She slammed both of her hands down on the polished wood of the podium, screaming at the top of her lungs. She accused me of being a cold, calculating monster. She shrieked that I had deliberately planned this entire spectacle just to ruin my sister's beautiful life. My father pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly between my eyes. He loudly ordered me to take the microphone, apologize to the wealthy investors, and claim that my entire financial presentation was a massive misunderstanding. He actually had the sheer audacity to demand that I liquidate my personal assets and write Terrence a check to cover the missing capital. He believed that my hard-earned money should be used to bail out a federal criminal simply to preserve their fabricated social status. I stood my ground, my posture perfectly straight, letting their hysterical demands wash over me like useless static. The investors surrounding us had gone completely quiet, watching this grotesque family dynamic unfold with morbid fascination. They were witnessing firsthand the exact environment of delusion that allowed a fraudster like Terrence to operate so freely. When my parents finally ran out of breath, panting and glaring at me with raw venom, I slowly raised my hand. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small encrypted flash drive. I stepped around my father and plugged the drive directly into the main interface of the massive digital presentation board Terrence had rented for his fake real estate pitch. I tapped a few keys on the control console, bypassing his glossy architectural renderings. I told my parents that they were fundamentally misunderstanding the depth of the catastrophic hole they had dug for themselves. I explained that Terrence did not just steal from the billionaires currently blocking his exit. I told them that a parasitic fraudster will always drain his most immediate trusting victims before branching out to strangers. I hit the enter key. The massive digital screen behind me flickered and blazed to life. A high-resolution scan of a highly complex commercial banking document filled the entire display. The font was massive, impossible for anyone to miss. I handed a laser pointer to my father and told him to read the bold text at the very top of the screen. He squinted at the glowing display, his chest heaving with exertion. The document was a heavily leveraged second mortgage agreement. The property listed as the primary collateral was not a commercial high-rise or an offshore asset. It was a precise description of a sprawling 5-bedroom suburban estate located in Winnetka, Illinois. My mother let out a strangled gasp. The address shining brightly on the screen was her address. It was the home she used to host lavish dinner parties and project an image of untouchable wealth. I grabbed the microphone and broke down the financial mechanics of their spectacular ruin. I explained that a $200,000 Hamptons wedding required massive immediate upfront liquidity. Terrence needed cash fast, but his fraudulent investment fund was already collapsing. Because my parents were so incredibly desperate to fund a wedding that would secure their fake social legacy, they had gladly signed a barrage of convoluted financial documents Terrence placed in front of them. I pointed directly at their verified signatures at the bottom of the digital projection. I told them that Terrence had secretly taken out a maximum capacity second mortgage on their primary residence. He had completely stripped every single dollar of equity out of the house they had lived in for 30 years. He used their home as a personal piggy bank to pay the elite New York caterers, the Parisian bridal designers, and the private orchestra. My father staggered backward, his legs suddenly giving out. He hit the edge of a heavy leather armchair and collapsed into it, his hands gripping his chest. He stammered frantically, denying the reality staring him right in the face. He claimed Terrence had promised the loan was just a minor temporary bridge mechanism that would be paid off the moment his new investment deals closed. I showed him the next slide. It was a certified banking ledger tracking the payment history of that specific second mortgage. The ledger was a sea of red ink. Terrence had not made a single monthly payment since the loan was originated. The debt had ballooned aggressively, compounded by astronomical late fees and predatory default penalties. I clicked the remote one final time. The screen transitioned to a stark official legal notice stamped by a federal bankruptcy judge. I read the terrifying document aloud, ensuring my voice carried to every corner of the room. It was a final, non-negotiable notice of aggressive foreclosure. I looked down at my mother. She was trembling violently, her eyes darting between the massive screen and the son-in-law she had worshipped as a financial god. I delivered the fatal, undeniable truth. I told her that the bank had already finalized the seizure protocols. I told her that on Monday morning, at exactly 8 o'clock, armed county sheriffs would arrive at their perfectly manicured stone walkway. They would physically and forcibly remove my parents from the premises, change all the commercial locks, and take absolute possession of the property. They had sacrificed their oldest daughter and their lifelong financial security to throw a party for a con artist. The illusion of their elite high society status was officially dead. On Monday morning, they would be utterly, completely homeless. My mother began to scream hysterically. Her high-pitched wails pierced the heavy atmosphere of the great room, bouncing off the vaulted ceilings like shattered glass. It was not a cry of sorrow. It was the visceral, agonizing shriek of a woman watching her entire fabricated identity burn completely to the ground. She collapsed onto the polished hardwood floor, tearing at her impeccably styled hair, mourning her lost social status, while her husband stood frozen, paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of his financial ruin. The deafening sound of my mother weeping acted as a violently explosive trigger for the man cornered by the stone fireplace. Terrence finally snapped. The suave, untouchable investment manager completely vanished, replaced by a cornered feral animal. He whipped his head toward Madison, his eyes bulging with wild, unfiltered rage. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at his new bride. He unleashed a torrent of venomous accusations, his voice booming through the great room. He screamed that he never wanted the extravagant Hamptons wedding. He explicitly blamed Madison for bankrupting his fragile fund. He told the room of furious investors that she had demanded the imported orchids, the bespoke Parisian gown, and the private orchestra. He claimed he begged her to scale back, telling her the fund was facing a severe liquidity crisis, but she had ruthlessly threatened to cancel the engagement if he did not deliver a billionaire-tier spectacle. He yelled that Madison forced him to take out the predatory second mortgage on her parents' home because her insatiable demand for luxury was draining his accounts dry. He publicly called her a greedy, superficial parasite who cared more about Instagram engagement than his actual freedom. The accusation was the absolute breaking point. The pristine, highly manicured socialite completely lost her mind. Madison let out a guttural, terrifying screech and lunged directly at her husband. She threw her entire body weight at Terrence, tackling him against the heavy stone of the fireplace. Her perfectly manicured acrylic nails dug into his face, scratching deep, bloody lines across his cheek. She tore at his custom velvet tuxedo, ripping the expensive fabric and popping the buttons off his crisp white shirt. She screamed that he was a pathetic, lying fraud who had ruined her life and destroyed her flawless reputation. Terrence fought back aggressively. He grabbed Madison by her wrists, forcefully shoving her away. She stumbled backward, her designer heels catching on the edge of an imported rug, but she immediately recovered and charged him again. She grabbed a heavy crystal whiskey decanter from the nearest side table and hurled it directly at his head. Terrence ducked just in time. The heavy crystal smashed violently against the stone fireplace, sending sharp shards raining down over the hardwood floor. The wealthy venture capitalist quickly backed away, creating a wide circle around the chaotic, violent brawl. Nobody intervened. They simply watched the spectacular implosion of a fraudulent marriage with pure, unadulterated contempt. My father finally snapped out of his catatonic state. He rushed forward desperately, trying to pull his golden daughter away from the man he had worshipped just an hour ago. He grabbed Madison by the shoulders, begging her to stop making a scene in front of the billionaires. Madison violently shoved her own father away, screaming that he was useless and had failed to protect her from a common con artist. Richard stumbled and fell hard onto the floor, landing right next to my weeping mother. Patricia reached out, trying to grab Madison's leg, wailing about the ruined family legacy. Madison viciously kicked her mother's hand away, entirely consumed by blinding, destructive rage. She did not care about her parents losing their home. She only cared about her own shattered image. Terrence realized the investors were blocking all the front exits. He tried to scramble toward the kitchen hallway, desperately looking for a back door, but Madison tackled him around the waist. They both crashed to the floor, rolling through the spilled champagne and broken crystal. The perfect couple, the elite socialites who had banned me from their wedding because I did not fit their flawless aesthetic, were now rolling around on the floor like feral dogs. They were biting, scratching, and screaming profanities at each other. They were tearing each other apart physically and verbally, desperate to save themselves at the expense of the other. I stood firmly behind the wooden podium, watching the magnificent destruction of their facade. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. They had built their entire relationship on a foundation of lies, theft, and extreme arrogance. They had gladly sacrificed my financial security and my parents' home to fund their illusions. Now the bill had finally come due, and the ultimate cost was their absolute ruin. The investors watched with cold, calculating eyes, already mentally preparing their civil lawsuits and federal affidavits. The room smelled of spilled alcohol, expensive cologne, and raw, suffocating fear. Terrence managed to push Madison off him one more time. He scrambled to his feet, his face bleeding, his tuxedo entirely shredded. He looked wildly around the room, breathing heavily, frantically searching for any possible escape route. Madison sat on the floor among the broken glass, her expensive gown ruined, sobbing and hurling venomous insults. The grand elite investor retreat had completely devolved into a pathetic, violent crime scene. I checked the silver watch on my wrist. The timing was absolutely perfect. The loud, aggressive confrontation had provided the exact distraction I needed. Right at that exact second, a new sound pierced through the heavy, toxic atmosphere of the great room. It started as a faint, high-pitched wail in the distance, rapidly growing louder and more distinct. The unmistakable rhythmic howling of multiple police sirens cut through the crisp Wisconsin air, echoing sharply across the calm waters of the lake, heading directly toward my private driveway. Federal law enforcement had finally arrived to shut down this criminal operation. The rhythmic howling of sirens rapidly escalated into a deafening mechanical roar that completely overpowered the frantic shouts echoing inside my great room. Brilliant flashes of red and blue light violently pierced through my floor-to-ceiling windows, painting the terrified faces of the wealthy investors in a harsh, unforgiving strobe effect. The sheer speed and overwhelming volume of the approaching vehicles signaled a massive, highly coordinated raid. This was not a simple domestic disturbance call. This was a targeted multi-agency federal strike. The heavy mahogany front doors of my Lake Geneva estate were forcefully shoved open. Half a dozen local county sheriff deputies stormed into the grand foyer, quickly followed by men and women wearing tactical vests emblazoned with bold yellow federal lettering. They moved with terrifying absolute precision. They fanned out across my custom hardwood floors, immediately securing every single exit and cutting off any potential escape route. The wealthy venture capitalists and tech executives instantly froze, their previous anger entirely replaced by the cold, sobering reality of a federal law enforcement raid. Several billionaires instinctively raised their hands, stepping far away from the shattered crystal and spilled champagne. They wanted absolutely nothing to do with the man bleeding by the fireplace. Terrence scrambled desperately against the rough stone of the hearth. He looked like a trapped rat. His custom velvet tuxedo was ripped and stained, his face heavily scratched from Madison's vicious attack. He frantically looked left and right, his eyes darting toward the floor-to-ceiling windows facing the lake. For a split second, he actually tensed his leg muscles, contemplating a completely suicidal dive through the double-paned glass. A seasoned federal agent immediately recognized the subtle shift in his body language. Before Terrence could even pivot his foot, two massive agents closed the distance with explosive speed. They grabbed Terrence by his torn lapels and violently spun him around. They slammed him face first directly into the solid stone of my fireplace. The heavy impact knocked the remaining breath completely out of his lungs. Terrence let out a pathetic, muffled groan as his cheek ground against the rough masonry. An agent forcefully yanked his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around his wrists echoed perfectly through the silent room. It was the absolute best sound I had heard in my entire life. The lead federal agent, a tall woman with a severe expression and a no-nonsense demeanor, stepped directly behind him. She did not raise her voice. She spoke with a lethal administrative calmness that carried effortlessly across the great room. She informed Terrence that he was officially under arrest. She loudly listed the devastating charges, ensuring every single billionaire investor heard the exact nature of his crimes. She cited multiple counts of felony wire fraud, aggressive corporate embezzlement, and the operation of an unlicensed fraudulent investment syndicate. She read him his Miranda rights with practiced mechanical efficiency. Terrence did not attempt to argue. He did not claim innocence. He simply hung his head in absolute crushing defeat as the federal agents firmly held him in place. Madison remained collapsed on the floor, surrounded by the shattered remains of the whiskey decanter. She pulled her ruined designer gown tightly around her shaking body, weeping hysterically as she watched her husband get chained like a common criminal. My parents, Richard and Patricia, were entirely backed into a corner by the advancing officers. My father clutched his chest, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He was watching his fake, high society empire disintegrate into a highly publicized federal crime scene. My mother squeezed her eyes shut desperately, trying to block out the flashing police lights and the harsh reality of her impending homelessness. The lead federal agent left Terrence in the custody of her subordinates and walked purposefully toward my wooden podium. I stepped forward to meet her, maintaining my flawless professional composure. I introduced myself clearly, stating my full legal name and my credentials as a licensed forensic accountant. The agent nodded, a look of profound professional respect flashing across her stern features. She confirmed that my digital whistleblower dossier had been received by the Regional Cybercrime Division earlier that morning. She told me that the sheer volume of certified banking evidence I had compiled was unprecedented. My meticulous, undeniable documentation had provided a federal judge with more than enough probable cause to sign an emergency arrest warrant in record time. I gestured toward the sleek metal cart pushed by my junior investigator. I officially transferred custody of the physical leather-bound dossiers to the federal agent. I explained that the folders contained the raw banking ledgers, the fraudulent marketing materials, and the exact routing numbers for Terrence's offshore money laundering network. The agent signaled to an evidence collection team. They immediately began bagging the thick folders, securing the very documents that would undoubtedly guarantee a lengthy federal prison sentence for my brother-in-law. The wealthy investors watched this exchange with stunned, silent awe. They finally realized that the woman standing before them was not just a disgruntled family member. I was the absolute architect of this entire takedown. Local deputies began interviewing the billionaires, collecting their contact information and initial statements regarding the fraudulent real estate pitch they had just witnessed. The great room of my luxury estate had completely transformed from a glamorous networking event into a heavily guarded federal staging area. Two agents hoisted Terrence to his feet. They began marching him toward the front doors, parading him past the very men he had intended to rob. His head was down, his shoulders slumped in total agonizing humiliation. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated his disgraced exit. But my strategic financial execution was not entirely finished. As Terrence was dragged out the front door, I turned my attention back to the woman sobbing uncontrollably on the floor. Madison thought the worst was over. She assumed she was just a tragic, victimized bride whose husband had lied to her. She had absolutely no idea that I had handed the federal agents a very specific document bearing her own forged signature. She had absolutely no idea that I had handed the federal agents a very specific document bearing her own forged signature. Madison pushed herself up from the debris of the shattered crystal decanter, her ruined designer gown pooling around her bruised knees. She quickly wiped the smeared mascara from her cheeks, instantly shifting her entire demeanor. The aggressive, violent woman who had just viciously assaulted her husband completely vanished. In her place stood a fragile, terrified victim. She looked up at the remaining federal agents and local county deputies with wide, innocent eyes. She began to weep softly, adopting a trembling, pathetic voice. She loudly claimed she was completely blind to her husband's business dealings. She swore she was just a traditional, trusting wife who had been maliciously deceived by a master manipulator. She desperately tried to paint herself as the ultimate casualty of Terrence's massive financial deception, crying that he had lied to her just as much as he had lied to the wealthy investors. My sister possessed a lifetime of experience playing the victim. She had always used her manufactured innocence to escape accountability, relying on our parents to clean up her messes and shield her from reality. She expected the federal agents to take one look at her tear-stained face, offer her a warm blanket, and treat her with absolute sympathy. The lead federal agent, who had just returned to the great room after handing Terrence over to the transport unit, stood over Madison with a completely blank expression. Madison reached out a shaking hand, begging the agent to help her get away from this nightmare. She sobbed about how her entire life was ruined and how she needed to go home to her parents to recover from the severe trauma. I did not let her finish her spectacular, fraudulent performance. I stepped out from behind the wooden podium and walked directly toward the center of the room. My heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor, a sound that made Madison physically flinch. I stopped right next to the lead federal agent. I looked down at my sister, feeling absolutely zero compassion for the woman sobbing at my feet. I turned my attention to the agent and spoke with a clear, resonant voice that carried across the quiet room. I informed the authorities that the woman crying on the floor was not an innocent bystander. I declared that she was an active, willing participant in a highly coordinated criminal conspiracy. Madison gasped, her eyes widening in genuine panic. She screamed at me to shut my mouth, aggressively accusing me of trying to frame her out of pure malicious jealousy. She looked at the federal agent and frantically claimed I was a bitter, estranged sibling, making up psychotic lies to destroy her reputation. I ignored her frantic shouting completely. I calmly reached into my black leather portfolio. I pulled out a thick, legally certified file folder and handed it directly to the lead federal agent. I explained exactly what the folder contained. I told the agent they were holding the original commercial promissory note and the fabricated power of attorney document. I pointed a steady finger directly at the crisp blue ink signatures at the bottom of the page. I loudly announced that Madison had personally forged my authorization to secure a predatory $2 million loan from a Las Vegas syndicate. I explained that she used my stolen identity to collateralize a high-interest financial instrument specifically designed to inject illegal liquidity into a collapsing Ponzi scheme. I detailed how that stolen money was immediately routed to pay for the extravagant catering, the imported champagne, and the luxury vehicle rentals for this exact event. The lead federal agent opened the file. She meticulously reviewed the legal documents, her trained eyes scanning the notarized seals and the clearly printed names. She looked at the forged signature, then looked back down at Madison. The shift in the agent's posture was immediate and terrifyingly absolute. The professional courtesy completely evaporated, replaced by the rigid, uncompromising stance of law enforcement confronting a verified felon. Madison realized the devastating trap had snapped firmly shut around her neck. The fake tears instantly stopped. She scrambled backward, her hands slipping on the wet floor, frantically trying to put physical distance between herself and the authorities. She looked wildly at our parents, screaming for them to do something. She begged our father to hire a massive legal team. She demanded our mother tell the police that the documents were a complete misunderstanding. But Richard and Patricia were utterly paralyzed. They were staring at the exact same forged documents I had slapped onto their dining room table less than a week ago. They knew those papers also bore their own signatures as fraudulent legal witnesses. They could not defend their golden child without immediately incriminating themselves in front of federal authorities. The lead agent did not hesitate. She barked a sharp command to the two deputies standing near the hallway. They closed the distance in 3 massive strides. They grabbed Madison by her bare arms, hauling her forcefully to her feet. Madison thrashed wildly, kicking her ruined designer heels and screaming at the top of her lungs. She yelled that she was a respectable socialite, that she lived in a luxury suburb, and that they had absolutely no right to treat her like a common criminal. Her arrogant, entitled protests fell on entirely deaf ears. A deputy forcefully twisted her arms behind her back. The cold, heavy steel handcuffs clamped down hard over her delicate wrists, the metallic ratcheting sound echoing with absolute finality. The agent stood directly in front of her, loudly reciting her Miranda rights. Madison was officially charged with severe identity theft, massive real estate fraud, and conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud. Each charge carried a mandatory minimum sentence that would effectively end her glamorous life forever. The sight of their golden child in handcuffs completely broke my parents. The paralyzing shock finally wore off, replaced by an agonizing, visceral despair. My mother let out a harrowing, blood-curdling wail. She threw herself forward, crawling across the hardwood floor on her hands and knees. She reached desperately for Madison, sobbing uncontrollably, begging the officers to take her instead. She screamed that her daughter was too fragile for prison, that her pristine reputation would be permanently destroyed. My father collapsed against a leather armchair, burying his face in his hands and weeping loudly. He watched his entire fabricated legacy disintegrate right before his eyes. His perfect daughter, the ultimate symbol of his high society aspirations, was being treated like a dangerous street thug. The deputies completely ignored the wailing parents. They gripped Madison firmly by the shoulders and marched her aggressively toward the front doors. She stumbled over the threshold, her head hanging low in absolute crushing shame. The wealthy billionaires, the exact people she had so desperately wanted to impress, stood silently watching her humiliating exit. They parted like the Red Sea, creating a wide path for the disgraced socialite. Madison was marched down the long stone walkway, her ruined dress dragging through the dirt. A local county sheriff opened the back door of a heavily caged squad car. They pushed her inside, slamming the heavy door shut, trapping her behind thick, reinforced glass. I walked over to the large picture windows and looked out at the driveway. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated the tears streaming down my sister's face. The squad car shifted into gear and accelerated down the long, winding road, carrying the golden child away to a cold concrete holding cell. The chaotic noise inside my house began to fade, replaced by the beautiful, hollow silence of absolute victory. My parents remained on the floor, clinging to each other, drowning in their own magnificent ruin. I did not offer them a single word of comfort. I simply turned away, ready to execute the final merciless phase of my financial retaliation. I simply turned away, ready to execute the final merciless phase of my financial retaliation. Exactly 1 week passed since the federal squad cars faded into the dark Wisconsin night. I returned to my downtown Chicago forensic accounting firm, finalizing recovery reports for defrauded investors. I did not bother to check my personal phone for any frantic text messages or missed calls from them because I already knew their exact inevitable fate. Monday morning arrived with absolute, ruthless punctuality as the banking system executed its final maneuver. I did not need to be there to see it unfold in real time. The public court filings detailed the entire brutal procedure. Two armed county sheriffs and a lending bank representative arrived at their suburban Winnetka estate. Richard and Patricia spent the entire weekend desperately begging wealthy contacts for a bridge loan. Every single desperate phone call they frantically made was quickly and violently rejected by their former friends. High society socialites do not lend money to the parents of a federally indicted fraudster. The sheriffs banged heavily on the grand oak front door, giving them exactly 15 minutes. They were not allowed to pack the expensive antique furniture, imported rugs, or fine china. The bank claimed all physical assets to offset the massive default penalties generated by Terrence. My mother walked out the front door carrying nothing but a small canvas duffel bag. My father trailed behind her, utterly broken, stripped of his commanding, arrogant corporate posture. Commercial locksmiths immediately changed the deadbolts, placing heavy steel padlocks on the custom iron gates. The bank seized the property, rendering my parents entirely homeless in a single morning. I knew they would eventually come looking for me after exhausting all other viable options. On Thursday afternoon, my receptionist buzzed my intercom, sounding slightly alarmed by the sudden commotion. She informed me two older individuals were aggressively demanding to speak with the senior investigator. I told her to send them directly back to my private corner office. I stood up, straightened my tailored suit jacket, and stood firmly behind my glass desk. The heavy frosted glass door swung open, and Richard and Patricia stumbled into my office. They looked absolutely unrecognizable, their pristine elite aesthetic completely erased by days of severe hardship. My father wore a deeply wrinkled suit that looked like he had slept in it. My mother had dark bags under her eyes, her immaculate hair tied in a knot. They stood before me, shivering slightly, clutching their meager belongings like desperate shipwreck survivors. My father spoke first, his voice lacking any trace of his usual booming authority. He whispered that they had been sleeping in their sedan in a commercial parking lot. He said they had no cash, frozen bank accounts, and no friends answering their calls. He stared at the floor, defeated by his own catastrophic arrogance and blinding social greed. My mother stepped forward, her hands clasped together in a desperate, frantic, pleading gesture. She started crying, weaponizing the exact same theatrical tears she used at the lake house. She begged me to forgive them, claiming they were deeply manipulated by Madison and Terrence. She asked for the access codes to my property, promising to only stay temporarily. She actually had the audacity to call me their last hope, leaning on biological duty. I let them finish their desperate, pathetic performance without offering a single word of sympathy. I calmly opened my locked desk drawer and pulled out a single crisp white paper. I slid it across the smooth glass surface of my desk. I told them to look very closely at the signatures at the bottom. My father leaned forward, his hands shaking violently, as he recognized the binding legal document. It was the liability waiver I forced them to sign before the catastrophic investor retreat. I reminded them they blindly signed a legal contract without reading a single paragraph. I read the specific clauses aloud, my voice echoing coldly off the glass walls. I read the section where they explicitly forfeited any future claims to my financial support. I highlighted the clause where they surrendered all rights to access my real estate properties. I pointed out the exact language confirming they completely indemnified me from any fallout. I looked my mother directly in the eyes. I told her I was not a bank, a charity, or their safety net. I reminded them that exactly 1 year ago they watched me drain my retirement savings. They claimed they were broke while secretly wiring hundreds of thousands to Hampton's wedding planners. I stated they had explicitly chosen Madison and Terrence over my very survival. I told them they were now experiencing the pragmatic lifestyle they mockingly assigned to me. They were living within their actual means. My father opened his mouth to argue, attempting to muster a shred of patriarchal rage. I did not give him the chance. I reached over to my desk console and pressed the security dispatch button. Two massive building guards immediately stepped into my office. I pointed at Richard and Patricia. I instructed the guards to escort these two trespassers out of the building. I explicitly ordered security to ban them from the premises permanently. My mother shrieked, reaching toward my desk, begging me not to abandon them. The guards firmly grabbed their arms, physically turning them around and marching them out. I walked over to my large window overlooking the Chicago River. I watched them get shoved out onto the pavement, clutching their small canvas bag as they shivered in the freezing winter wind. They had absolutely nowhere left to go, completely abandoned by the high society they worshipped. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt or regret. I turned around, sat back down in my comfortable ergonomic office chair, and went right back to doing my highly successful work. The toxic, incredibly damaging, and emotionally abusive chapter of my life involving my biological family was now permanently, irrevocably closed forever. Exactly 12 months passed since that freezing afternoon in my downtown office. The turning of the calendar brought a profound, irreversible shift in the power dynamics of my universe. The massive federal investigation I initiated into Vanguard Elite Holdings concluded with lethal efficiency. The prosecution was completely relentless. They did not need to negotiate or offer lenient plea deals because my meticulous forensic dossiers had already done 90% of the heavy lifting. The trial was a highly publicized media circus, but I did not attend a single day of the proceedings. I did not need to sit in a crowded courtroom to witness their destruction. I read the final sentencing reports from the comfort of my penthouse. Terrence was convicted on 34 counts of federal wire fraud, aggravated identity theft, and massive corporate embezzlement. The federal judge, a notoriously strict adjudicator who despised white-collar criminals, handed down a crushing 20-year sentence in a maximum security federal penitentiary. The arrogant, flashy investment manager, who once boasted about leased private jets and guaranteed double-digit returns, is now wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit. He spends his days sweeping concrete floors for pennies an hour, entirely stripped of his custom velvet tuxedos and his diamond-encrusted watches. His billionaire investors successfully liquidated whatever meager assets he had left, leaving him with absolutely nothing but decades of hard time. Madison did not fare much better. Her desperate attempt to play the innocent victimized bride completely failed under aggressive federal scrutiny. The prosecution presented the forged Lake Geneva title deed and her signature on the fraudulent power of attorney. She was convicted of severe real estate fraud and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in a federal correctional institution. The ultimate golden child, who once threw catastrophic tantrums over imported orchids and bespoke Parisian gowns, now lives in an 8 by 10-foot concrete cell. She shares a metal toilet with strangers and eats institutional food from a plastic tray. The high society elite she so desperately wanted to impress have entirely forgotten her name. She is a disgraced footnote in a financial scandal entirely erased from the glamorous world she sold her soul to enter. My parents. Richard and Patricia avoided federal prison, but their punishment is arguably much more agonizing. They narrowly escaped criminal charges by claiming utter financial ignorance, but they could not escape the devastating civil penalties and total social annihilation. The banking institutions seized absolutely everything of value to satisfy the ballooning debt Terrence had secured against their primary residence. They were left completely destitute. The country club friends they had spent decades trying to impress instantly blocked their phone numbers. High society permanently closed its doors to the parents of a convicted federal fraudster. They now live in a cramped, incredibly run-down one-bedroom apartment in a high-crime neighborhood on the outskirts of the city. They survive solely on their meager monthly Social Security checks, carefully budgeting for generic groceries and basic utilities. My mother, who used to arrogantly pour vintage Cabernet and boast about her flawless legacy, now spends her days clipping coupons and staring at the peeling wallpaper of her low-income rental. My father, the man who demanded I liquidate my hard-earned assets to save his fake empire, now works a part-time minimum wage job just to keep the lights on. They are completely isolated, living in a miserable purgatory of their own making. They have no money, no status, and absolutely no family left to exploit. While their world violently collapsed into ash, my empire exponentially expanded. The highly publicized takedown of Vanguard Elite Holdings became the ultimate marketing campaign for my forensic accounting firm. Federal prosecutors and high net worth individuals recognized the surgical precision of my investigative work. Within 6 months, my firm secured massive multi-year consulting contracts with both the Securities and Exchange Commission and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We specialize in dismantling complex Ponzi schemes and tracking offshore money laundering networks. My daily consulting rate tripled, and my client waiting list stretches out for over a year. I hired a team of elite junior investigators, moved my corporate headquarters to a sprawling top-floor suite in a premier Chicago skyscraper, and effectively doubled my annual revenue. I stand at the absolute pinnacle of my profession. I am highly respected, fiercely independent, and financially untouchable. I did not achieve this extreme level of success by playing the role of the compliant, pragmatic sister. I achieved it by aggressively defending my boundaries, utilizing my unparalleled professional expertise, and absolutely refusing to be a collateral casualty in someone else's desperate quest for validation. I upgraded my Lake Geneva estate, adding a professional-grade security command center and a custom outdoor kitchen. I spend my weekends hosting genuine supportive friends who respect my drive and celebrate my achievements. I do not have to hide my success to protect fragile egos. I do not have to endure toxic Sunday dinners filled with backhanded compliments and manipulative financial requests. My environment is completely devoid of the parasitic anxiety that defined my entire childhood. I recently received a notification from the State Correctional Facility regarding an incoming communication request. It was a formal, heavily monitored digital message sent directly from Madison's prison account. She was likely seeking commissary money or attempting to manufacture a tearful, desperate reconciliation to ease the harsh reality of her incarceration. I did not open the message. I did not read a single word. I simply selected the communication request, clicked the permanent block option, and deleted the notification from my inbox entirely. I took a sip of my expensive coffee, looked out over the sweeping views of the Chicago River from my corner office, and smiled. I had absolutely no space left in my life for convicted criminals. I had an empire to run. Society constantly force-feeds us a very specific, deeply flawed narrative about family. We are conditioned from birth to believe that blood is an unbreakable contract. We are told that sharing DNA means you must automatically endure endless disrespect, financial exploitation, and emotional abuse, simply because the people hurting you happen to be your parents or your siblings. We are instructed to keep the peace to be the bigger person, and to quietly absorb the damage so the family portrait remains perfectly intact. I am here to tell you that this narrative is the most dangerous scam in existence. Blood does not equal loyalty. Blood is nothing more than a biological coincidence. True loyalty is built entirely on a foundation of mutual respect, consistent honesty, and reciprocal care. When you strip away the sentimental programming and look at toxic family members through a purely objective lens, the reality becomes glaringly obvious. If a stranger treated you the way your toxic family members do, you would cut them out of your life without a second of hesitation. You would call the police. You would file a restraining order. You would walk away and never look back. My parents and my sister treated my success as a threat, and my financial stability as a communal asset waiting to be plundered. They believed they were entitled to my resources while simultaneously denying me basic human respect. They excluded me from a wedding to protect a fraudulent social image, then demanded the keys to my luxury property to save a failing criminal enterprise. They did not love me. They loved what they thought they could extract from me. Setting boundaries with people like that is not an act of malice. They will scream that you are being selfish. They will call you cold, unfeeling, and cruel. They will weaponize your guilt and try to turn your remaining relatives against you. Let them. You must understand that when toxic people accuse you of being selfish, what they are actually saying is that you are no longer behaving in a way that serves their incredibly selfish interests. Setting hard, impenetrable boundaries is not a character flaw. It is absolute fundamental survival. It is the necessary surgical amputation of a rotting limb to save the rest of the body. If I had caved to their demands, if I had handed over the keys to my lake house out of some misplaced sense of familial duty, I would have been dragged straight down to federal prison alongside Terrence and Madison. My reputation as a forensic accountant would have been permanently destroyed. My hard-earned assets would have been seized by the government to pay off their defrauded investors. My parents would have happily watched me burn if it meant they could keep playing country club socialites for one more week. That is the absolute truth about parasitic relationships. They will bleed you completely dry and then complain that you did not provide enough blood. The greatest lesson I learned from dismantling my family's fraudulent empire is the true nature of retaliation. We are taught that revenge is a fiery, explosive emotion. We picture screaming matches, thrown decanters, and dramatic physical confrontations. Madison proved exactly how useless and destructive emotional reactions truly are when she attacked her husband in front of a room full of billionaires. Anger makes you sloppy. Rage makes you vulnerable. The sweetest revenge is never emotional. It is precise. It is highly calculated. It is completely silent until the exact moment it needs to be deafening. It is legally binding. When you are dealing with manipulative narcissistic abusers, you do not fight them with feelings. You fight them with hard, verifiable data. You fight them with contracts, ledgers, and undeniable evidence. You let them build their own arrogant house of cards, and then you simply remove the table from underneath them. You do not need to seek out vengeance. You simply need to stop protecting them from the consequences of their own horrific decisions. The moment you remove your safety net, their entire world will inevitably collapse under the weight of their own incompetence and greed. Today I stand at the absolute pinnacle of my industry. I am surrounded by fiercely intelligent, genuinely supportive colleagues and friends who value my mind and respect my boundaries. I built a multi-million-dollar enterprise not by waiting for my parents to finally approve of me, but by realizing their approval was entirely worthless. My success is the ultimate, undeniable proof that I was never the problem. I was simply the one who refused to play along with the lie. Today, I stand at the absolute pinnacle of my industry. I am surrounded by fiercely intelligent, genuinely supportive colleagues and friends who value my mind and respect my boundaries. I built a multi-million-dollar enterprise not by waiting for my parents to finally approve of me, but by realizing their approval was entirely worthless. My success is the ultimate undeniable proof that I was never the problem. I was simply the one who refused to play along with the lie. You have the exact same power residing inside of you right now. You do not have to accept the role you were assigned by people who fundamentally misunderstand your worth. You can draft a new contract. You can evict the emotional squatters from your mind. You can build an empire so incredibly massive that it casts a permanent shadow over everyone who ever tried to keep you in the dark. Have you ever been excluded and used by the people who share your DNA? Tell us how you took your power back in the comments below. If this story fueled your fire, hit that like button. Share it with someone who needs to set boundaries today, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss another ultimate comeback. See you at the top.